Chapter 28 Waiting in Vain. In the courtyard of the White Horse at Fontainebleau, at noon on April 20th, Napoleon said goodbye to his old guard, attended by a few officers who had remained faithful to him. He said a few words to them, kissed the eagle which General Petit extended to him, and wound up, "Farewell once more, my old comrades. May this last kiss of mine remain in your heart." Then he got into the carriage which was to take him to Fréjus, where he would embark for Elba. The Allies had allowed him 600 men to accompany him into exile. 6,000 presented themselves, all ready to go with him. Before his departure, Napoleon had a long talk with Caulaincourt. "Go and see the Empress," he said to him, "but I definitely forbid you to urge her to join me. Let her own heart guide her. If it moves her to come to me, I shall receive her with open arms. If not, let her stay at Parma, or Florence, or in whatever duchy is granted to her. I ask her only to send me my son." Napoleon now saw his future in less somber colors. To confirm his optimism, he read over again a letter which his father-in-law had written to him from Rambouillet on April 16th. In this letter the Emperor Francis addressed him as "my brother and dear son-in-law," assured him that Marie-Louise should join him as soon as her health was restored, and promised to treat the King of Rome as though he were his own son. Here was the Austrian Emperor's word, pledged by a promise in writing. How could Napoleon suppose that 4 days earlier he had written to Metternich, "The essential thing is to get Napoleon away from France, and please God may he be sent far away. I do not approve the choice of the island of Elba. We cannot accept it as a lasting arrangement." No sooner had Napoleon landed in Elba than he set about making preparations for his wife's arrival. She must have apartments worthy of her, both at Porto Ferrajo and at Porto Longone. He reserved the best rooms, the brightest and coolest rooms, for her. He put work in hand and hurried it up. Suppose she should arrive before everything was ready. He suggested a symbolical design for the ceiling of one of the drawing rooms, representing 2 pigeons tied together by a cord whose knot tightened as they flew away from one another. He looked forward to fireworks, balls, and kinds of festivities. Nothing must be lacking in the reception he prepared for his wife. But weeks went by, and the Empress said no word about coming to join him. Napoleon was consumed with impatience. Marie-Louise's letters became fewer. They seemed to Napoleon to be less affectionate. They rang false in his ears. What was happening? Then he learned that Marie-Louise had gone to Aix alone, leaving the little king behind at Schönbrunn. Napoleon scented some underhand maneuver. He had something like a presentiment that Marie-Louise was betraying him. He urged her to go to Tuscany, where there are waters just as good and of the same nature as those of Aix and Savoy. He sent to Parma a detachment of Polish light cavalry to form her guard, and 100 carriage horses. As yet he did not really doubt his wife. He was sure that she was acting against her will, that she was being imposed upon and misled. He did not even accuse his father-in-law of these intrigues. They could only be the work of some officious minister. He rebelled against them. Nobody, he wrote, has any rights over the Empress and her son. At the beginning of August, he could stand it no longer. He sent Colonel Lasinsky to Aix with instructions to tell Marie-Louise that he was expecting her at the end of the month. Make a complaint, he wrote to the colonel, against the procedure which is being adopted of preventing my wife and son from writing to me. This procedure is most unworthy. A few days later he sent Captain Hérault, who was married to one of the Empress's Red Women, to Aix. He was to see the Empress in secret, and advise her to make her escape and go to Genoa, where the brig, inconstant, such are the ironies of fate, would be waiting to bring her to Elba. But the captain failed in his undertaking. Madame de Brignol gave him away to Napoleon, who had him arrested and escorted to Paris. Finally, on August 28th, Napoleon received the letter which Marie-Louise had entrusted to Bossuet on July 31st, together with the little marble bust of the King of Rome. He took heart again. Meanwhile, the heat drove him to take refuge at the hermitage of the Madonna di Marciano, over 3,000 feet above sea level, in the midst of an oak forest. The hermits made room for him by occupying the cellars. Madame Mère, who had joined him, lodged in the village 900 feet lower down. In the morning of September 1st, Napoleon was informed that a lady accompanied by a handsome, fair-haired boy had landed during the night. He jumped out of bed. It's Marie-Louise, and the King of Rome. He hastened to meet them, and whom did he see? Madame Walewska and her son. Still he was delighted to see the dearest of all his mistresses, and the son whom she had given him. He kept them for 48 hours, but in the greatest secrecy, lest Marie-Louise should get word of their visit to him, and take offense at it. September passed, and October followed. Napoleon's suspense became unendurable. Marie-Louise had almost given up writing to him. He had to wait until January 1st before he received a few cold lines from her. This was the last echo of their love. After that, she never wrote again. The only news of his son which reached him was such as Nezelof was able to send to Grand Marshal Bertrand through the medium of his bankers. It was too much. Napoleon complained to the English commissioner resident in the island about the inhuman way in which he was being treated. In modern times, he said, no example can be quoted of such unfairness, such barbarity, without any reason of state to justify it. Then he found a source of hope. The Grand Duke of Tuscany had resumed possession of his state. He was the former Grand Duke of Würzburg, who had been one of the witnesses to Napoleon's marriage, and godfather by proxy of the King of Rome. Napoleon called him "my dear uncle," surrounded him with attentions, and loaded him with presents. It was to Napoleon that the Grand Duke owed the fact that he had kept his duchy during the storm which had swept Europe for the past 20 years. If he was not an ingrate, he might be ready to serve Napoleon as an intermediary. Putting his pride in his pocket on October 10th, Napoleon wrote to the Grand Duke of Tuscany. Humbly he asked for leave to send him a letter for the Empress once a week. His Highness at Florence was much embarrassed. Finally, he decided to hand Napoleon's letter over to the Austrian Emperor, thus faced with a thorny problem for his conscience. Francis, after several days' deliberation, at length consigned the letter to the Imperial Archives, after showing it to Marie-Louise and formally forbidding her to answer it. When he learnt what had happened to his letter, Napoleon shut himself up in silence. He wrote no more. He made no further overtures. But day and night his son's picture was never out of his mind. He could still see him as he had left him lying in his cot, that little boy who was all his hope. He loved talking about the boy. Never did he let a day pass without recalling some story about him. He delighted in remembering the departure of Marie-Louise and the King of Rome from the Tuileries, and the boy's wrath and reluctance to let them take him away. Here, Napoleon thought, his son showed a gift of foresight most valuable in one who might some day be called upon to lead a nation and rule a state. But would the Prince of Parma ever have a chance to make use of this gift? Poor little devil, he said to himself. Many a time in the course of the day, Napoleon took his snuff-box out of his pocket, not to take a pinch, but to look at the portrait of the little king, painted on its gold-mounted tortoise-shell lid. He studied the portrait for a moment or two, sighed, and put the snuff-box back in his pocket. One afternoon he had it in his hands while he was inspecting some work in progress. He stumbled, and the snuff-box slipped from his grasp and fell to the ground. Despite his paunch, he bent down hurriedly, picked it up, and wiped it on his sleeve. He had gone quite pale. "Thank God," he exclaimed, "it isn't damaged. I should have been so sorry if my clumsiness had spoiled my poor little boy's face." He turned to his suite. He felt that he must explain his feelings to them. "I've a bit of a mother's affection for him," he said. "In fact, I've a great deal of such an affection, and I'm not ashamed of it." He paused, nodded his head, and completed his train of thought. "I wouldn't like to count on the friendship of a father who didn't love his children." One day in December, Grand Marshal Bertrand's brother landed on the island. He showed Napoleon some engravings which he had bought in Rome on his way. Napoleon looked at them. All at once he flushed. "Why," he cried, "here's one of Marie-Louise." But he soon recovered from his disturbance. He studied the engraving and criticized it. "It's like her," he said, "but there's something about the mouth which isn't the Empress." The next engraving represented the King of Rome, saying his prayers. At the sight of it, Napoleon's hands trembled. He gazed at the engraving for some time, and made no effort to hide his emotion. "My son, my little son!" The note of sadness which weighed his voice clutched at the hearts of his suite. Nobody said a word. All at once Napoleon stood up and took refuge in his bedroom. It was some time before he came out again, and when he did his face was drawn. The boy he loved was not now the heir to his empire. the first link in the chain of his dynasty. No, he was just his son, the child of his flesh, the son whom he was not allowed to kiss and caress, the son who had been stolen from him. The injustice of it, the vile trick of which he was the victim, wrung his heart cruelly. His impotence filled him with rage and revolt. "My son," he said, "my son has been taken away from me, like the sons of the vanquished in days gone by, to grace the triumph of the victors." Chapter 29. The Return from Elba. Napoleon was too close, and he loomed too big. The shadow which he continued to cast over Europe frightened the victors, still wondering how they had ever managed to overcome him. All those emperors, kings, and princes assembled at Vienna, who could not speak his name without a shudder, were never far from Napoleon's thoughts. He knew that they found him an embarrassment. He felt their hatred around him like something palpable. He was aware that there were plots to assassinate him, and that, failing his death, plans were being made to remove him elsewhere. Talleyrand had suggested the Azores, and Poza de Borgo, St. Helena. Meanwhile, Napoleon had unmasked the machinations of his father-in-law. He was now certain that the Austrian emperor, false to his pledged word, had planned to rob him of his wife and his son, and never meant to restore them to him. He saw a barrier of silence and isolation slowly closing around him. His position was now clear. He could expect no help from anybody except himself, if he wanted ever to clasp his wife and his son to his heart again. He must go and wrest them from their ravishers, sword in hand. Napoleon made up his mind to act. He awaited only a favorable opportunity to set out. On February 13th, 1815, Fleury de Chamblon, who had been sub-prefect of Reims the year before, arrived at Porto Ferrajo in disguise. He brought Napoleon a letter from Marat, in which the former Minister for Foreign Affairs set forth the situation in France. The Bourbons were unpopular, the army was dissatisfied and ripe for revolt. The people looked back on their emperor with regret. Let Napoleon return to France. He would be welcomed by the nation as a liberator. Napoleon hesitated no longer. He gave orders for departure. Preparations were rushed through in the greatest secrecy. On February 25th, Napoleon addressed a proclamation to the army. Victory will advance at the charge. The eagle with the national colors will fly from Belfry to Belfry to the towers of Notre Dame. The next day, at 8 o'clock in the evening, he embarked for France. Standing in the Inconstant's bows, he meditated, with his eyes fixed on the wintry sea. A great hope filled him. The world of adventure lay before him anew, but what he wanted to win back was not so much supreme power as a little boy's fair head and 2 innocent arms, whose embrace now meant more to him than his throne. On the night of March 6th, the Empress Maria Ludovica had invited the court and the members of the Congress to a gala performance, at which living pictures were to be given. Festivities were in full swing. The principal scene was much admired. It represented a meeting between Maximilian I and Marie of Burgundy, from a picture by the Viennese painter Peter. In it, figured the prettiest ladies of the court, the Duchess de Sagon, the Comtesse de Fouche, and Talleyrand's niece. Waltz music set everybody dreaming. All at once, nobody knew whence it came or by whom. A rumor ran, like a bat with silent wings, whose shadow brings bad luck. People whispered to one another, "Do you know what I've just heard?" "No, what is it?" "He's escaped." "Who's escaped?" "Napoleon. He left Elba on February 26th. Cheeks turned pale under makeup. Everybody felt a stab of fear. People refused to believe it. "It's only a false report. Who told you?" Names were whispered. Lord Stuart, the English plenipotentiary, Corsini, Talleyrand. That sounded more serious. Talleyrand was well informed. But where is he going? Nobody knows. Perhaps to Naples, perhaps to America. Everybody thought. To Paris, but nobody dared to say it. The characters in the living pictures gathered together and argued excitedly, forgetful of precedents. The ancient armor of Maximilian and his soldiers filled the great room with a clink of metal. People glanced at the door furtively, as though the sinister shape of a little hat might appear there at any moment. The atmosphere became oppressive. Everybody present felt that his possessions, his honor, his very life were all being threatened. Anger, dismay, and hatred falsified judgment and distorted feeling. Snatches of sentences whistled through the air like bullets. If he's taken alive, he ought to be hanged. He ought to be shot. Death to him. Leaning against a marble pillar, Talleyrand screwed up his eyes, fluffed up his shirt frill, shrugged his shoulders, and declared, in a judicial tone of voice, "We'll have to get rid of him like a mad dog." Suddenly everybody remembered important business at home, which would not wait. In a few moments the palace was deserted. Fear had cracked the whip of panic. Thus small birds of prey take to flight, and come to earth when the eagle's wings loom over the horizon. Metternich, who had not attended the gala performance, had gone to bed late. Early in the morning, an urgent dispatch was brought to him. "What is it about?" he asked sleepily. "A dispatch from our consul at Genoa." "Your Excellency." "Our consul at Genoa," said the Chancellor to himself. "A minor official trying to make himself important. I'll attend to it in the morning." Half an hour later, however, finding himself unable to get to sleep again, he took up the dispatch and opened it. His hair stood up on his head. He sprang out of bed. Bonaparte escaped. A few moments later, with his lips tense with hatred and his eyes bloodshot with bile, he had himself announced to his master, the Emperor. By 10 o'clock in the morning, he had seen the Emperor of Russia, the King of Prussia, and all the other kings, princes, and dukes. By 11 o'clock, couriers were carrying orders to the Allied armies, which were on their way back to their garrisons, to about face, and march once more to the French frontier. Marie-Louise heard the news later in the day, upon her return from a romantic ride on horseback with Napoleon. It was Napoleon himself who undertook to break it to her. as gently as his knowledge of her sensitiveness, her touchiness, demanded. Marie-Louise nearly fainted. She sank into an armchair and burst into tears. She sobbed so loudly that she could be heard in the antechamber. Nieperg could find no words to comfort her. His expressions of optimism did not suffice to relieve her distress. The Archduke John was announced. He found Marie-Louise weeping as though at a deathbed. He offered his sympathy. "I'm so sorry for you, my poor Louise. All I hope for your sake, and for ours, is that he may break his neck." Marie-Louise went on moaning. Fate was too unkind to her. Life was all troubles these days. Her friend, Madame de Brignol, was very ill. There was even talk of administering the last sacrament to her. "Long live the Emperor!" shouted the servants of her household, when the news of Napoleon's escape reached them. Marie-Louise was cut to the quick, and nearly fainted again. In a fury, Nieperg threatened the servants with hanging, and dismissed the lot of them. Marie-Louise felt her flesh creeping. The future yawned before her like a pit of hell, with Napoleon awaiting her in the depths of it, as inviting as a demon. Must she sink into it? Ah, no, anything rather than return to him. She wrung her hands. "I'd rather go into a convent." There was no doubt that Napoleon would demand her back. She was not far from hating this husband of hers, who carried his audacity, his lack of consideration, to the point of wanting to have his wife and his son with him. Why had he left Elba? Why couldn't he have remained quiet? She could have arranged her life so nicely without him. A peaceful, uneventful, luxurious life, with a lover devoted to her, and the prospect of playing the sovereign in a little duchy, and having all the advantages of ruling without any of the inconveniences. She was only 24, and love and adulation and a nice sovereignty awaited her, and now her husband had come back. If she obeyed Bonaparte's summons, she would have to resume her life as empress. She would once more be only a pawn in his hands. She would have to submit to her lord and master's orders, and be at his beck and call. Marie-Louise buried her buzzing head in her hands. What was she to do? Meneval advised her to join Napoleon at once. It was her duty as much as her interest. But Nieperg was on the watch, and his arguments proved more persuasive. It would be madness for her to join Napoleon. He had no chance. The whole world was against him. He would be crushed once more, and as for her, she would lose her duchy forever in the disorder. Marie-Louise looked up startled. Nieperg felt that he had touched her in a sensitive spot, and he pressed his advantage cleverly. "Louise," he said, "my dear Louise, consider for yourself. Remember all the trouble we had to get the Tsar and the King of Prussia to promise that you should be given Parma, and don't forget that the agreement is not yet signed. Talleyrand is still maneuvering, and you know how dangerous that man is. The ex-queen of Etruria is demanding the duchy for her son. Talleyrand is supporting her more strongly than ever, and he has influential people on his side. One false move on your part, and he may still win." Nieperg stopped. Beneath the burning eye which he bent upon her, Marie-Louise felt her will-power weaken. "You are right, my dear. I won't go. But tell me what I ought to do." A slight smile twitched Napoleon's lips. "That's quite simple," he said. "Write a letter to your father, and say that you put yourself under his protection. You will thus give proof of your goodwill and submission. The Allies will be bound to take it into account, and you will make sure of your duchy." Marie-Louise stood up. She felt as though she had come to life again. When he received Marie-Louise's letter in his study, Metternich would have jumped for joy, if an Austrian chancellor could have done so without compromising his dignity. She had written, "My very dear father, at this moment, when a fresh crisis threatens the peace of Europe, and I am menaced with further misfortune falling upon me, I cannot hope for a safer refuge, or a more beneficent protection, than that which I request from your fatherly affection on behalf of myself and my son." Metternich was exultant. He measured the moral effect which Marie-Louise's letter would produce upon his new allies. This formal repudiation of Napoleon by his wife would cement the Corsican brigand's reputation as an evildoer. On March 13th, the powers assembled at the Congress of Vienna published a manifesto in which they declared Napoleon to be an outlaw under the ban of Europe and civilization, and held him up to public opprobrium. Running his hands through his hair, Talleyrand had limped resentfully from one Congress table to another. He found the sentence on Napoleon too mild. "He's only a brigand," he declared, "and he ought to be treated as a brigand. We should have given everybody the right to kill him at sight." The next day, delighted with himself, Metternich brought the text of the manifesto to Marie-Louise. As she read it, she felt a sense of anxiety, and something like remorse. "If he is taken prisoner," she asked, "what will be done with him?" Metternich's reply was definite. In Austria, he would be shut up in a fortress. In France, he would probably be hanged. Marie-Louise thought that over. Like a good mother. "After all," she said, "it would be a pity if my son had a father who was hanged." Chapter 30. Refusal. Once the news of Napoleon's escape from Elba was confirmed, Metternich became a prey to a fresh anxiety. Suppose the French should try to kidnap the Prince of Parma and take him to his father. At all cost, Metternich must keep his hostage. Hager, the Minister of Police, doubled the guards around Schönbrunn. An exact description of the boy was sent to the frontier post, with orders that he was not to be allowed to leave the country on any pretext. Hager found the prince's entourage suspect. Had not Anatole de Montesquieu, his governess's son, been seen waiting at the end of the park with a berlin all ready for a long journey? Hager declared that he could not undertake responsibility for the boy's custody under such conditions. Napoleon's son must be removed from Schönbrunn to Vienna, where it would be easier to guard him, and the French still in his service must be dismissed. The Emperor admitted the force of these arguments. On March 19th, the prince was taken to the Hofburg in Vienna. Every morning, Italian soldiers paraded past the palace, waving their hats on the end of their rifles, and shouting, "Evviva il nostro Napoleon!" It was clearly time to strengthen the bars of the boy's cage. The next step was to make a clean sweep of those around him. On March 20th, Baron von Wissembourg, the Grand Chamberlain, presented himself before Madame de Montesquieu, and transmitted to her an order from the Emperor, relieving her of her duties at once. The governess protested, wept, and entreated, but the Grand Chamberlain stood firm. The Emperor's will was irrevocable. "In that case," said Madame de Montesquieu, "I require a written order and a medical certificate attesting that I leave the prince in good health." They hastened to satisfy her requirements. The Emperor gave her a testimonial of his esteem, to which he added a set of sapphires. Marie-Louise, for her part, sent her an affectionate letter, together with a lock of the boy's hair. On March 21st, Madame de Montesquieu kissed for the last time the child, to whom she had been a mother for the past 4 years, and took her leave of him. She counted on leaving Vienna the next day, but she reckoned without Metternich, whose subtle hatred of Napoleon neglected nothing. If Madame de Montesquieu returned to France, her first concern would be to give Napoleon news of his son. He did not deserve that satisfaction, and it would be good strategy to deprive him of it. Besides, Madame de Montesquieu had seen too much at Schönbrunn. So when she proposed to leave Vienna, she was refused a passport. For the next 3 months she had to live confined in a little 2-room apartment, in company with her son Anatole, who had been stopped at the frontier, arrested, and brought back to Vienna. Meanwhile, Meneval, Napoleon's faithful secretary, went on struggling vainly in an effort to persuade Marie-Louise to join his master. He harried her without respite. How could she think of remaining apart from the Emperor? He loved her, and she had nothing with which to reproach him. Did she not see that her separation from him would put her wholly in the wrong? Marie-Louise listened in embarrassment to Meneval's lecture. Then, with a hypocritical sigh, she said, "Since I did not accompany Napoleon to Elba when he was persecuted by the whole of Europe, it would be improper for me to join him on the throne now that he has recovered his power. As for my son, I shall not forget him. Once I am established in Parma, I shall be able to save 500,000 francs a year for him, and so make sure that he will be independent." Meneval stared in astonishment at this emperor's daughter and emperor's wife, who talked like a shopkeeper. "Madame," he replied, "Napoleon's son is in no need of money. What it is essential to keep for him is a throne." But Marie-Louise was scarcely listening to him. Obviously her thoughts were elsewhere. Napoleon had left her on April 1st to fight against Murat. Their farewell had been heartrending. Napoleon had promised to write to her every day. Marie-Louise's thoughts were with the man she loved. She trembled at the idea of his being exposed to the terrible chances of war. He had now been gone 18 days, and as yet she had received no letter from him. She spent her days in anxiety, and her nights in weeping. Her impatience was equaled only by the impatience with which Napoleon in Elba had awaited a letter from the woman he loved. Meneval realized that there was only one thing left for him to do. He himself asked to be relieved of his duties. His request was readily granted. They were only too glad to be rid of him. On May 7th, he said goodbye to the young prince. The next day he took leave of Marie-Louise. She said to him, with a touch of emotion, "All contact between myself and France must henceforth cease. Monsieur Meneval, but I shall always remember my adopted country." Heartbroken, Meneval asked her, "What am I to say to the Emperor on your behalf, madame? Can I give him any hope?" But Marie-Louise cut him short. "Assure the Emperor that he has my best wishes. Try to make him understand my unhappy position. He must accept our separation, but let him be sure that I retain an unaltered feeling of esteem and gratitude towards him." Marie-Louise seemed in better spirits. She had good reason. During the last few days, good news had showered upon her. On April 23rd, the Countess von Neperg had died. Moreover, the ex-empress of the French was on the point of reaping the reward of her submission and her cowardice. On May 27th, the Congress of Vienna, though without saying a word about her son or the succession, granted her the duchies of Parma, Piacenza, and Guatella. At the same time, Neperg received a recompense to which his brains, his zeal, his initiative, and his gallantry fairly entitled him. He was appointed court-martial, a title which gave him the privilege of riding in the same carriage with Marie-Louise on the occasion of official ceremonies. "God be thanked," Marie-Louise said to herself. Her horizon was clearing. Only the shadow cast by the wings of the escaped eagle sometimes passed over her smiling prospects. It made her shudder. "I make a vow," she told Countess Matrosky, her lady-in-waiting, "that I will go on pilgrimage to Maria Zell on foot if he is taken alive." Chapter 31. A cobbler is happier than I am. As the master of France advanced in triumph, the Paris papers became suddenly inspired with a timely enthusiasm for him. Their tone exactly reflected the progress of his adventure. "Bonaparte has disembarked at Gouffouin, March 1st. Grenoble has opened its gates to General Bonaparte, March 8th. Napoleon has made his entrance into Lyons, March 11th. His Majesty the Emperor has arrived at the Tuileries Palace, March 20th. Napoleon did not wait until the tricolor flew triumphantly over Paris to write to his wife, from Grenoble, from Lyons, from Fontainebleau. Almost every day he sent her letters asking her to come and join him as soon as possible. Once he was back in Paris, though he had to get the country in order, reorganize the army, refill the treasury, revive national feeling to meet coming trials. Still, his first concern was to recall his wife and his son. They must be there. He must be able to show them to the people. Without them he was lost. His son, above all, was essential to him in order to weave together the nation and his empire by fresh links of enthusiasm and affection. On March 28th, Napoleon wrote to his wife, "My dear Louise, I am master of all France. The people and the whole army are in a state of the greatest enthusiasm. the so-called king had fled to England, if not further. The commanders of all the fortresses over which my flag floats, and all my old guard, are around me. I spend my days reviewing 25,000 men at a time. France fears nobody. I shall expect you during the month of April. Be at Strasbourg with my son on the 15th or the 20th. Goodbye, my dear, all yours, Napoleon. 6 days later he wrote again, I am beloved by everybody and master of everything. All I lack is you, my dear Louise, and my son, so come to me at once by way of Strasbourg. Let them make haste. Everything was ready to welcome them. On April 1st, Napoleon wrote to the Austrian Emperor, appealed to his feelings as a father, and asked him for his wife and his son, the object of his dearest affections. Every day he sent ambassadors, envoys, and secret agents to Vienna, bearing letters and instructions. He was full of courage and hope. To be sure, Marie-Louise had not joined him when he was banished to Elba, but now that he was back from exile, and emperor again, doubtless the lure of the throne would make her hasten to him. But the days went by, and Napoleon had no word. He did not yet know that his emissaries, Flot, Montrond, and Stassart, had failed in their mission. At the news of his return, all the women who had sincerely loved him hastened to his side. Madame de Palopra came from Lyons. Madame Walowska came from Naples. Mademoiselle Georges, mere actress though she was, made a point of testifying her attachment to him. His stepdaughter Hortense joined him too, only his legitimate wife was absent. Despite appearances, Napoleon still found excuses for Marie-Louise. If she had not obeyed his summons, it was because she had been prevented. He refused to believe that she no longer loved him. She was his wife. There had never been a harsh word between them. He still had too vivid a memory of her affection, her passion, to doubt her. But Marie-Louise's silence was endless. There was nothing from her, not a word, not a sign of life. She might as well be dead. Then little by little, light dawned on Napoleon. At first, it was but a faint, murky ray, but day by day it became brighter, and more cruelly penetrating. The first traveler whom Napoleon was able to question was Captain Hurault, who arrived from Vienna at the end of March, but Hurault was reticent. He knew nothing. He had been kept at a distance. He was not familiar with the secrets of the Empress's circle. Then Montrond arrived with a letter from Nezelof to Caulaincourt, who hastened to show it to Napoleon. Nezelof cautiously raised a corner of the veil. The Empress's mind has been so worked upon that she can contemplate return to France only with terror. All possible means have been employed for the last 6 months to alienate her from the Emperor. "Ah," cried Napoleon, "I knew it. I knew they must have done violence to her feelings for me and for France." But he was still doubtful. He wanted details of this hateful machination. Would Balouis, Marie-Louise's accountant, be able finally to clear up this inexplicable mystery? Balouis, arrived from Vienna on April 28th. Napoleon was so impatient to see him that he posted an orderly at his door, with orders to bring him along without even giving him time to change his boots. Alas, a fresh disappointment awaited Napoleon. Balahoui was a decent fellow, but a poor observer. He knew nothing. He had kept his nose to his account books. He had seen nothing, heard nothing. At least, so he said. There remained Nezelof, whose departure from Vienna was at hand. He would know. Napoleon was sure of that. Ah, when would he be able to question him, to get the truth out of him, even though it cut him to the heart? The two of them were in the Emperor's study at the Tuileries. Napoleon, in foot grenadier's uniform, royal blue cloth, with white lapels and scarlet epaulets, stood leaning against the mantelpiece. Logs were burning in the fireplace, although it was the middle of May. At last he had got hold of Nezelof, with his secret inside him, like a nut in which the almond might be either sound or rotten. Napoleon, standing opposite Nezelof, studied his secretary with his keen eyes. He found him aged and thinner. His hair, brushed back, had gone white. The varying blue of the Emperor's eyes went suddenly black, and Nezelof felt them fixed upon him. They seemed to burn him. Then questions poured out of Napoleon's mouth like a flow of lava. "Well, Nezelof, you've just left my son. Tell me all about him. How is he? Is he in good health? Has he grown? Come on, tell me everything you can. Everything, mind you. I want to know everything." Ill at ease, Nezelof did his best to smile. "Sire," he said, "the prince is in excellent health. He is strong for his age. He is very much alive, and everything about him promises a long, healthy life. He has developed a lot, and he measures 2 feet 6. He still has his lovely fair hair, falling in big curls on his shoulders. His lovely fair hair." Napoleon closed his eyes for a moment to capture the blessed vision which those words evoked. Then he opened them again, and asked eagerly, "And do they take good care of him? Whom has he got around him?" "Madame Soufflot, her daughter, and Madame Marchand, the nurse. They are the only French women left. But your Majesty may be easy in your mind. They watch over him with all the love with which all France could surround the prince. Good-hearted women, I won't forget them. But what about Madame de Montesquieu? She has been replaced by Countess Mitrovsky, who is very much in favor." Napoleon turned pale. "Oh, to think of my son in the hands of an Austrian woman! But in that case, why has Madame de Montesquieu not returned to France?" "They kept her in Vienna by force, sire. They refused her a passport. The Emperor kicked viciously with his heel at the logs in the fireplace, and set the sparks flying. 'I'll take my revenge for all that,' he cried. But go on, Nezelof. You were saying that my son is very wide awake." "Most precocious, sire, full of brains. You'll scarcely believe it, but already he's got a taste for soldiering." "Has he, at his age?" "One day he said to me, 'I want to be a soldier, like Papa. Then I'll lead charges like him.' I objected, 'But the bayonets will stop you, Prince.' He shook his head confidently and said to me, But won't I have a sword to sweep them aside? Dear little fellow. Napoleon said nothing for a few moments. His eyes strayed around the room, gathering memories. It was in this study that he had spent, with his son, perhaps the happiest hours of his life. Here was the corner of the desk against which the boy had one day bumped his forehead so hard that it made him cry. "Fie, sire," his father had said to him, as he gave him a kiss. "That's naughty. A king mustn't cry." Here was the mirror at which Napoleon had made funny faces to amuse his son. Here was the carpet on which the two of them had played with the movable mahogany pieces, one at real war, the other at war for fun. Then, with a quiver in his voice, the Emperor asked, "Does he remember his father?" Meneval's face shone with the joy which he could give his master. "Sire, if anybody mentions your name, he never takes his eyes from him. But does anybody ever talk about me?" "Often, very often. For example, a month or two ago, Sir Neil Campbell, the English Commodore, who accompanied you to Elba, came to see the Prince. He took him up in his arms, kissed him on both cheeks, and said to him, 'Your papa told me to give you a kiss from him.' The Prince was holding a German doll. He dashed it down on the ground so violently that it broke and burst into tears. 'Poor papa,' he said, 'poor papa.' There was a long silence. They could hear the crackling of the fire and the sound of troops assembling in the Place du Carrousel for review. Napoleon raised his head. He looked at his secretary with a face which had suddenly gone haggard. "Meneval," he said, in a hollow voice, "a cobbler is happier than I am. At least he has his wife and his children beside him." Then he started walking up and down the room, with his hands behind his back, questioning Meneval all the time. He wanted to know everything. He was interested in the smallest details about his son's games, his walks, his clothes. Meneval answered obediently. And so the time passed. Little by little, night fell, bringing the darkness so suitable for terrible confessions. By now Napoleon was almost afraid of hearing the truth. He did not dare to look at Meneval as he asked, "And what about the Empress? Did you see her before you left?" "I went to take leave of her. We had a long conversation. When we parted, she gave me this snuff-box, with her monogram in diamonds on it." Then, scarcely moving his lips, he added, "She seemed to be to me very sad." "Sire, yes, really very sad." His words, conventional and reticent though they were, still fired Napoleon with a little hope. "What did she say to you? Did she think she could soon come and join me?" Meneval said nothing. Napoleon persisted, trembling with impatience. "Come on, speak, man. I want to hear the whole truth." "Sire," Meneval went on, "she said to me, 'I am in a difficult position. I cannot go against my family. I was born under an unlucky star, and I shall never be happy.'" Napoleon nodded his head. "Indeed, she has had a hard time, through my fault, and she is young. She is a weak character, and easily influenced. He was still ready to make excuses for her, yet her submission to her family astonished him. "But didn't she get my letters of March 28th and April 4th, in which I asked her to come and join me by way of Strasbourg?" Meneval hung his head and lied. "No, sire, they never reached her." How could he tell Napoleon that one night in Vienna, between 10 and 11 o'clock, he himself had received the first of these letters from one of Napoleon's emissaries, that he had delivered it to Marie-Louise, and that the next day the Empress had handed it over to Metternich? How could he tell Napoleon that the letter entrusted to Montrond had also reached its destination? Again, he himself had had it in his hands, but knowing what Marie-Louise would do with it again, in agreement with Madame de Montesquieu, he had given it to Madame Soufflot to burn. Napoleon had started walking up and down the room again, faster than ever in his agitation. "Things will be very different," he said, "once victory has smiled on me again." Then he returned to the subject which he had on his mind. "But did you reason with her, Meneval? Did you really point out to her her duty as a wife and a mother?" "I did not fail to do so, sire. I called her attention to the awkwardness of the false situation in which she was deliberately putting herself. She said to me, I should never agree to a divorce, but try and make the Emperor understand that our separation has become essential." Napoleon lost his temper. The deep blue of his eyes turned steel gray. It wasn't Marie-Louise herself who thought of that. I know her heart too well, but who turned her against me? You know who it was, Meneval. You saw them at their dirty work. Was it my father-in-law? Was it my mother-in-law? Was it Metternich? And was it that fellow Neperg too? Just who is Neperg? What kind of man is he? Tell me about him." Napoleon flung himself upon Meneval, seized him by the shoulders, and gazed into his eyes. Pale and trembling, the secretary looked away in embarrassment. But little by little, such was Napoleon's magnetic power, he was forced to meet his eyes. The two men stared at one another. Napoleon shuddered at the distress, the dismay, in Meneval's eyes. It was as though his soul looked out of them and said, "No, don't force me to tell you the whole truth. Have pity on me. Have pity on yourself." In his turn, Napoleon looked away. He took his hands off Meneval. No, he must not know. Words once spoken can never be recalled. He must not give Marie-Louise's betrayal of him definite shape. He must keep his faith intact. He had to go on believing in his wife. He had to believe in her for his own sake. He had to believe in her for the sake of France. He must rouse the people to indignation. He must be able to say to them, "See, your Empress and your future Emperor are kept prisoners, and those who commit this crime are the people who claim to be acting in the name of virtue, in the name of divine law." So let Meneval keep silent. It was essential that Marie-Louise, wife and mother, should still seem sure. The only part she could play was that of a victim, so that Napoleon might paint a heart-rending picture of her cavalry which would raise all France against his enemies. Napoleon pulled himself together. "She need not worry," he said bitterly. "I shall not use force to make her come back to me. If she does not change her mind, I can content myself with my son. He at least is faithful to me." Meneval's face lit up. "Ah, indeed he is, sire," he exclaimed. Napoleon looked at his secretary in surprise. "What do you mean by that, Meneval? Have you still something to tell me?" "Yes, sire." In a voice broken with emotion, Meneval went on. "Before I left Vienna, I went to the Hofburg to say good-bye to the prince. I found him with his new governess and Madame Soufflot. Usually, when he saw me, he ran to meet me, clapping his hands, bubbling over with chatter and laughter, but this time he didn't. He stared at me from a distance, as though I were a stranger. I went over to him, took him by the hand, and said, 'I'm going to see your papa again, Prince. Have you anything to say to him?' He glanced at his governess, and looked up at me sadly. Then he gently took his hand out of mine, and without answering me went and stood in silence in a window recess. From there he kept his eye on me. I took my leave of the ladies, and went over to him again. As I bent down to kiss him, he glanced at his governess to make sure she was not looking. Then he pulled me by the sleeve, and in a trembling little voice whispered to me very low, 'Monsieur va, tell him that I love him just as much as ever.' The two men, the emperor and his subject, gazed at one another, with the tears running down their cheeks. 'My son,' breathed Napoleon, 'they have robbed me of a boy like that.' He drew himself up and clenched his fist. 'God,' he growled, 'it will take plenty of blood to expiate such a crime.